I want to begin with a single piece of wood, small enough to hold in two hands and heavy enough to make you set it down again. It is a corner of timber, an elbow, dark and close-grained, and the striking thing about it is that the grain inside does not run straight. It curves. It follows the bend of the piece from one end to the other, the way the grain inside a tree's branch follows the branch, because a curved branch is exactly what this once was. The men who built wooden ships had a name for a piece like this. They called it a knee, or a futtock, and for the whole class of curved pieces they used an older word still. They called it compass timber, and a single curved knee of southern live oak, cut by hand out of a coastal swamp, was the one piece of wood that a wooden warship simply could not be built without. Hold that curve in your mind, because everything in this story runs through it. Not the mast, not the deck planking, not the tall straight pine that anyone could find. The curve. The frame of a ship. The ribs that give the hull its shape and take the shock of the sea and the shock of a cannonball, has to bend, and wood does not like to bend. You can saw a curve out of a straight plank, but then the grain of the wood runs off the edge of your curve, and the piece is weak in exactly the place it has to be strongest. There was one way around that. You found a tree that had already grown the curve you needed, with the grain running the whole way around the bend, and you cut your ribs straight out of the living shape of it. In North America, there was really only one tree that could do that at the scale a warship demanded. It grew on the southern coast. It was named, of all things, for Virginia, and bringing it down was some of the hardest and deadliest work in the early republic. The tree is the southern live oak, and its Latin name is Quercus virginiana, named for Virginia because the northern edge of its range begins in the Virginia tidewater, down around the mouth of the Chesapeake, before it runs south along the coast through the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida and around to the Gulf. It is not a tall tree. If you are picturing the straight forest giants of Maine or Michigan, put that picture away. A live oak is low and enormous and wide, throwing out huge horizontal limbs that curve down toward the ground and back up again, so that a single old tree can shade half an acre. To a lumberman looking for straight boards, that shape is worthless, because almost every branch bends. But to a shipwright looking for the ribs of a frigate, that same shape was the most valuable wood on the continent, because every one of those great curving limbs was a knee or a futtock waiting to be cut out whole. And the wood itself was extraordinary. Live oak is so dense that a block of it, dropped in water, barely floats at all. A single cubic foot of it, freshly cut, could weigh 75 pounds. It resists rot, it resists salt air, and its fibers grow interlocked, twisted around one another, so that it holds together under a blow that would split ordinary oak straight along the grain. A ship framed in live oak was not merely strong, it was strong in a way that no other American wood could match, and the men designing the first United States Navy understood that completely. The man who understood it best was a Philadelphia shipbuilder named Joshua Humphreys. When Congress voted to build the country's first 6 frigates, in the Naval Act of 1794, Humphreys drew them, and he drew them around a strange and expensive idea. A young country could not afford to match Britain or France, ship for ship. So he designed frigates that were longer, narrower, and far more heavily built than any frigate afloat, rated at 38 to 44 guns, with diagonal braces worked into the frame to keep the long hull from sagging at the ends, and with sides so thick they had more in common with a small ship of the line than with an ordinary frigate. The whole design leaned on framing the ships in live oak. Humphreys wanted the densest, strongest, most curve-rich wood in the world wrapped around the bones of his ships, and that meant somebody had to go down to the southern coast and cut it. That is where the hard part of this story begins, and where the first of the people I want you to hold in mind comes in. In August of 1794, the Navy sent a New England shipwright named John Morgan down to St. Simon's Island, off the Georgia coast, to run the cutting. With him went a crew of experienced axemen and woodcutters from New England, men who had spent their lives felling northern timber and knew exactly what they were doing with an axe. It did not save them. They arrived at the worst possible time of year, into heat and dense underbrush and standing water, and the coast began to kill them. Within a few months, many of the New England cutters were dead, most likely of malaria, and most of the rest were too sick to work or had deserted. The skill that had brought down the forests of Maine was no defense at all against a Georgia summer. So the Navy turned to the only workforce on that coast the planters would supply, and here the story becomes one that has to be told plainly and with care. When the frigate captain John Barry came down that same autumn to see why the work had stalled, he began hiring enslaved laborers from the plantations of the Sea Islands. The record is specific about the numbers. Barry hired 6 enslaved men from one plantation owner, 10 more from another, at least 5 from a third. Across the years that followed, gang after gang of enslaved and free black workers did the actual labor of finding, felling, and shaping the live oak that framed the young Navy. They were the ones who brought the curve out of the swamp. Now, let me put the two halves of that workforce beside each other, because the contrast is the heart of it. We know a good deal about John Morgan and John Barry and Joshua Humphreys. We have their names, their ranks, their letters. The enslaved men who did the cutting after them come down to us almost entirely without names, because the Navy's books were built to record two things: the timber and the money, and a human being was neither. The timber was counted to the piece. The payments were recorded to the planter who claimed to own the labor. The men who actually swung the axes appear, when they appear at all, as a number in a column, or a first name in some plantation owner's private ledger. That gap, between the timber we counted so carefully and the people we did not, is the thing I keep coming back to in this story. Consider what the Navy was actually asking that coast to produce. A single one of Humphreys's frigates needed something on the order of 1,000 separate pieces of live oak, each one a specific curve for a specific place in the frame. The timber for the most famous of them, the ship that became the USS Constitution, came from roughly 2,000 live oak trees cut at a place called Gascoigne Bluff on St. Simon's Island. 2,000 trees, each one taken apart by hand into the bent ribs of a single ship. And live oak, remember, is the hardest common wood in North America, and these were not neat straight trunks but massive twisting limbs. Every curve had to be cut, hewn, and trimmed to shape with axe and adze and saw, in the heat, by hand. There was no other way to do it, and there would not be for another 100 years. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. The Navy did not stop at hiring trees either. It began buying whole islands. In 1800, the government purchased Blackbeard Island, off the Georgia coast, more than 5,000 acres of standing live oak, and held it as a timber reserve for the yards. Over the decades that followed, the live oaking settled into a seasonal trade of its own, a whole branch of American labor that ran from the 1790s until about 1880, gangs going down to the southern coast, each cool season, to cut the ribs of the fleet, and hauling out again before the fevers came back with the summer. For the better part of a century, the strength of the American fleet started with a work gang standing in a Georgia swamp with a broadaxe, and the wood earned every bit of that labor, which is why the country kept going back for it despite the cost in lives. A frame of live oak could outlast the ship built around it. It was the reason a well-framed American frigate could take punishment that shattered other ships, and it is the reason, as we will see, that one of these hulls is still floating today, more than 2 centuries later, with some of that hand-cut southern oak still inside her. The curve held. It always held. The question the young Navy never quite let itself ask out loud was how long a coast could keep giving up that curve before it ran out. And the cutting was only the front end of a system that reached up the whole Atlantic seaboard. The curved timbers, once shaped, were hauled to navigable water and shipped north to the building yards, and one of the most important of those yards sat in the Virginia Tidewater, on the harbor we now call Hampton Roads. At Gosport, across the water from Norfolk, the Navy leased and then bought a shipyard that would frame some of the largest warships in the fleet out of this southern oak. So the wood named for Virginia, grown thickest far to the south, came back to a Virginia yard to be raised into the ribs of a man of war. Keep Gosport in mind. We come back to it when the frames go up. Come back to the compass timber, because I have told you it mattered and now I want to show you why, in the actual physics of a wooden hull. A ship's frame is a row of ribs, and each rib is not one piece but several curved pieces joined end to end, rising from the keel at the bottom up to the top of the side. The lowest and most brutally stressed of those pieces are the floor timbers and the futtocks, the parts that take the twist of the sea and the weight of the guns. If you cut one of those curved pieces out of a straight plank, the grain of the wood runs off the curve, crossing the edge, and the piece will fail along that grain under a hard enough load. But if you can find a piece of wood that already grew in the shape of the curve you need, the grain follows the bend the whole way around, and the piece is as strong as the tree was. That is what a live oak limb gave you. Already curved, already grown, the grain running true around the bend. A shipwright would tell you the best knee is the one where the grain follows the sweep of the wood, and no sawn timber can match a grown one. The crooked live oak, useless to anyone building a barn or a floor, was the single best natural source of that grown curve in the world. Its limbs became the futtocks and the floor timbers down at the keel, the hanging knees and lodging knees that locked the deck beams into the sides, the hawse pieces the anchor cables ran through, and the great curved timbers of the stern. Anywhere the ship had to turn a corner and still take a beating, it turned that corner in live oak. And there was a real practical cleverness in how the yards captured those curves. Before the cutting gangs ever went into the woods, the shipwrights up at the building yards made molds, thin wooden patterns cut to the exact shape of every curved timber in the ship. Those patterns went south with the cutting parties. A man walking through a stand of live oak carried the shape of a specific rib of a specific frigate in his hands, and he was hunting the forest for a limb that matched it, a tree that had happened to grow the curve the ship needed. When he found it, the piece was cut and hewn down to the mold, right there in the woods, so that what left the coast was not raw logs but the rough ribs of a named ship, already close to their final shape. It meant a live oak forest was read less like a stand of lumber and more like a set of parts waiting to be matched. The eye that could look at a wild tree and see the third futtock of a 44-gun frigate hidden inside it was a specialist's eye, and much of that eye, on that coast, belonged to enslaved men. So come down to the cutting grounds with me, into the live oaking itself, because this was the work that broke people. The season ran through the cooler months, roughly late fall into spring, partly because that was when the sap was down and the timber cut best, and partly because the coast in high summer was lethal. The gangs worked the sea islands and the tidal forests, ground that was half solid and half water, tangled with saw palmetto that had to be cleared by hand before a man could even reach the base of a tree. Then came the tree itself. A live oak does not fall like a pine. It is low and massive and spreading, its weight thrown out sideways into those enormous limbs, and taking one apart meant felling the trunk and then cutting free each great curving branch, every one of them as hard as iron and as heavy as stone. Live oak is dense enough to turn the edge of an axe. A gang squared and shaped each piece where it lay, hewing the iron-hard wood down to the pattern with broad axe and adze, the chips coming off small and heavy, and the frames they shaped this way could outlast almost everything built around them. Live oak resisted the rot that ate ordinary ship timber, so a live oak frame might still be sound after 50 years, while the pine decking and the white oak planking over it were torn out and replaced again and again. The bones lasted. That was the whole reason the country was willing to pay in lives for them. The work was slow, and it was dangerous, and it went on in heat and damp that bred sickness in nearly everyone who stayed in it too long. I told you the New England axemen died. The men who replaced them faced the same fevers, only in far greater numbers, and with far less written down about it. The black workers, enslaved and free, who did the bulk of the live oaking across those decades, met the same malaria that had killed the northern crews, on top of the ordinary lethal accidents of felling the hardest wood on the continent by hand. And the historical record, which kept the timber counts so faithfully, kept the human record only in fragments. There is one that stays with me. In 1817, a supervisor's journal on Blackbeard Island, another of the Georgia live oak islands the Navy had bought, listed the workforce on site as 21 enslaved men, 1 enslaved woman, and her child. That is nearly the whole entry. 21 men, a woman, and a child, brought to a fever coast to cut warship timber, set down in the record only by their number and their condition. We do not even know what the child was called. This is the part of the story I want to hold still for a moment, without decoration and without turning it into anything other than what it was. The ribs of that early Navy, the live oak that made those ships famous for their strength, were cut in large part by people who were themselves owned, on a coast that killed the free men who tried the same work. Their skill was real, and it was specialized. reading a wild live oak for the curve hidden inside it, felling it, hewing it clean to a pattern, was knowledge, hard-won, and passed from hand to hand, and the ships could not have been built without it. And the same records that preserve, down to the single piece, how much timber came off that coast, preserve almost nothing of the men and women who cut it. The Navy paid the people who claimed to own them. The books balanced. The names did not survive the balancing. When you stand on the deck of the ship all this produced, you are standing on the work of people the country counted as property, and did not trouble to name, and the least the record owes them now is to say that plainly. Now follow the timber north, because cutting the curve was only half the battle. A shaped live oak futtock could weigh a ton or more, and it had to be moved from where the tree fell, through swamp and sand, to water a ship could reach. Teams of oxen dragged the timbers to the creeks and the landings, and from there they went by schooner up the coast to the building yards, to Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and to the Navy Yard at Gosport in Virginia. Months of coastal labor and coastal dying arrived at a northern waterfront as a stack of dark, curved, impossibly heavy ribs, each one already cut to the mold of a particular ship. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. At Boston, the most famous of these ships took shape at a yard belonging to a builder named Edmund Hart, under a master shipwright named George Claghorn. The keel they laid down in the fall of that year was 21 inches thick, 4 great lengths of white oak scarfed and bolted into one backbone. And then the live oak came up out of the coasting schooners, and the frame began to rise, rib after curved rib of that dense Georgia timber bolted into place, until the skeleton of the ship stood above the rooftops of the surrounding town, a thing so massive that people came simply to look at it. This was the USS Constitution, and even unplanked, just a cage of live oak ribs, she was visibly heavier built than anything around her. And down in Virginia, the Gosport Yard was doing the same work with the same southern oak. It had already built one of the first 6 frigates, the Chesapeake, and in the decades that followed it would frame some of the largest warships the country made, up to and including a 74-gun ship of the line, the Delaware. Gosport would even open the first dry dock in the Western Hemisphere, in 1833, and float one of those live oak giants into it. The wood named for Virginia had come home to a Virginia yard and been raised into the heaviest warships in the fleet. Everything I have described so far, the curve, the density, the 1,000 hand-cut ribs, the men who died getting them, was a bet. It was a bet that a ship framed this heavily in this particular wood could do something no other frigate could do. And on one August afternoon in the middle of a war, the bet was tested in front of witnesses. On the 19th of August 1812, the Constitution, under a captain named Isaac Hull, met the British frigate Guerriere off the coast, and the two ships closed to short range and began firing into each other. The Guerriere was a proper Royal Navy frigate, and her gunners were good, and at close range they hammered the American ship with 18-pound iron round shot, the standard heavy ammunition of a frigate action, and the shot did not go through. Sailors on the Constitution watched British cannonballs strike the side of their ship and glance off into the sea, failing to break through the wall of white oak and live oak, and one of them shouted that her sides must be made of iron. The name stuck to her that day, and has never come off. Old Ironsides. The iron was live oak, cut by hand on a fever coast, the interlocked grain of those Georgia limbs soaking up the blow of a cannonball and holding. None of that was luck. It was the density and the thickness that Humphreys had designed in, and the coast had paid for. The Guerriere's shot was meeting more than 2 feet of layered oak, live oak frames set close together with heavy planking over them, the whole hull sheathed below the waterline in copper rolled by Paul Revere, and that combination absorbed and turned the impact. The Guerriere, meanwhile, came apart under the Constitution's guns, and by the end of the fight she was so wrecked that the Americans burned her rather than try to bring her home. A single afternoon had proved the whole expensive idea. The curved wood worked. The ships the young country had framed out of that impossible southern timber could stand in the line and win, and the reputation of the United States Navy was, in a real sense, built out of live oak. And the Guerriere was not the only proof. Across the War of 1812, the live oak frigates took on the most powerful navy on earth and won single-ship duels that almost no one had believed an American frigate could win, and each time the reports came back to the same stubborn fact that these ships could soak up punishment and keep fighting. British officers began measuring the captured American frigates and asking how they had been built so heavy and so strong. The answer was a wood that grew on a coast most of the world had never heard of, cut by hands the record did not keep. The country understood, sooner than you might expect, what it was spending. Live oak grew only on a narrow coastal band, and it grew slowly, and every frigate ate a small forest of it. As early as the 18-teens, the Navy was worried about running out. It sent surveyors down to map what was left. One of them, a man named John Landreth, spent the winter of 1818 into 1819 working his way along the Gulf Coast on foot and by boat, cataloging stands of live oak and red cedar for the Navy, and the journal he kept of that miserable, patient survey still exists. The country was taking careful inventory of a resource it had already begun to exhaust. And then it did something genuinely new. In 1828, under President John Quincy Adams, the federal government set aside a tract of live oak forest on the Gulf Coast of Florida, on a peninsula between Pensacola Bay and Santa Rosa Sound, and made it the Naval Live Oaks Reservation, to be protected and cultivated so the Navy would never run short of ship timber. It was the first federal tree farm in the history of the United States. The man put in charge of it, Henry Marie Brackenridge, began actually experimenting with planting and raising live oak on purpose, which makes him, by most reckonings, the first federal forester the country ever had. Within a few years, the government controlled so much of the remaining live oak that it held a near monopoly on the wood. Pensacola was the largest and most famous of these holdings, but it was not the only one. It also protected live oak reserves at other points along the Gulf, a small federal system of guarded forests held for the single purpose of ships that had not yet been built. A country that had almost run out of the one timber its warships needed had invented conservation forestry to keep from running out entirely. And then the whole problem dissolved on its own. The forests had not grown back. What ended the live oaking was that the ships themselves changed. Iron, and then steel, replaced oak in warship hulls. Steam replaced sail. Within a generation of that Florida reserve being set aside, the wooden warship was obsolete, and the enormous machine that had been built to feed it live oak, the surveys, the reservations, the cutting gangs, the molds, wound down and stopped. The Navy no longer needed the curve. And here is the quiet, strange ending of the material itself. The great stands of coastal live oak, cut hard for the better part of a century, and never replanted at anything close to the rate they were felled, thinned out, and were cleared for cotton and for towns, until the big, old, curve-rich trees that a frigate frame demanded became genuinely rare. The compass timber did not run out in one dramatic year the way the Michigan pine later would. It was used up slowly, and then no longer needed, and the knowledge of how to read a forest for a ship's rib faded out with the men who had carried it. So what is left of the live oak now? And here the story does something almost nothing else in this series does. The ship is still here. The USS Constitution still floats in Boston Harbor, the oldest commissioned warship afloat anywhere in the world, and she is still, at her core, the same live oak frame those gangs cut on the Georgia coast in the 1790s. Some of the original hand-cut southern oak is still inside her right now. This is the same wood those gangs cut on the Georgia coast, still holding the same shape, more than 2¼ centuries after it was hewn to a mold in a swamp. You can go to Boston and stand a few feet from it. But keeping her afloat has proved, over and over, the whole point of this video, that the timber is effectively gone. When the Navy carried out a major restoration of the Constitution in the 1990s, it needed new live oak compass timber to replace what had finally rotted through, and it discovered how hard that had become. You cannot send a cutting party south anymore and find frame-grade live oak the way John Morgan's men once did. The trees of that size and that curve are protected, or built over, or simply gone. So the live oak for the restoration came, in the end, from disaster. When Hurricane Hugo tore across the South Carolina coast in 1989, it knocked down old live oaks around Charleston, and the city gathered those fallen trees and donated them to the Navy, and a paper company gave more off its own land. The strongest warship wood the continent ever grew, the wood that turned cannonballs, could only be collected, 2 centuries on, from what a storm happened to blow down. That is how completely the live oaking is finished. And it had happened at least once before, in a gentler way. When the ship was restored back in the 1920s, the live oak to do it still came from that very Florida reserve, so the forest the government had protected in 1828 fed the ship it was made for at least one more time. Some of that forest did survive, and it is worth going to see. The first Federal Reserve on the Florida coast is still there, folded now into a national seashore, over 1,000 acres of live oak protected as a park, the descendants of the very stand the Navy set aside to build ships. You can walk under those trees, huge and low and spreading, their limbs curving down and back up in exactly the shapes a shipwright once hunted, and if you know what you are looking at, every branch overhead is a frigate's rib that never got cut. The tree the country nearly used up is still standing, in the one place the country decided to protect it. Which brings me back to the men, and to the gap I said I keep returning to. We have the timber counts. We have Humphreys's drawings and Hull's battle report, and the exact thickness of the Constitution's sides. What we mostly do not have are the names of the people who cut the wood that made all of it possible. The New England axemen who died in the first season, and the far larger number of enslaved and free black workers who did the bulk of the labor across 50 years, and are recorded, most of them, as nothing but a figure in a column. A woman and her child on Blackbeard Island in 1817, listed without a name. I think the honest way to look at Old Ironsides now is to see two things in the same hull at the same time. It is one of the great engineering achievements of the early Republic, a ship so well made that she is still afloat. And it is a monument, whether anyone ever intended it to be one, to the skill and the suffering of people the record refused to name. Both of those are true, and the wood holds both of them up at once. The curve I started with, that dark bent knee of Georgia oak, carries the whole story inside its grain, and it has been carrying it, quietly, for more than 200 years. That, to me, is why one timber is worth a whole hour of your attention, not because the ship is famous, but because the curved wood at the center of it remembers what the paperwork tried to forget. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.